So we are back again for another preview show, and again we are previewing Wembley for the second time this season, and who would have thought that at the start of the year that would be going twice, but here we are. To talk about it, we've got former Sunderland player Kieron Brady. How are you doing, Kieron?
Very well, thank you.
And we also have the Sunderland Echoes, Phil Smith.
Alright.
So we'll start off, I think we should look at the semi-finals first, and we'll start with Charlton. They took on Doncaster over the two legs and ended up going to penalties, 4-4, ironically. A nice nod to 1998 there, but let's start with Lyle Taylor. 22 goals this season, a player Sunderland won with in the summer as well. What do you make of his performances, and do you think it's as simple as stopping him means Sunderland will stop Charlton?
I think it probably depends how they set up, really. I think what stands out with Lyle Taylor when I've watched him play this season, it's not just his goals contribution, and it's not just the fact that he's a kind of a target man player. Obviously they normally play with a diamond, and he's so good at drifting into little pockets of space. He comes deep, he drifts out wide, he's brilliant with his feet. I think he's by some distance the best player in the division.
So better than Aidan McGeady?
Non-Sunderland player.
Oh,
Best
okay.
non-Sunderland player in the division. From what I've seen, he's got strength, he's great with his feet, and he's good in the air. So I think it's a big challenge for Sunderland. He's certainly the heartbeat of how they play, but if you can shut them down, it's going to make a big difference. We saw when they played at the Valley earlier in the season, the first half, Charlton tried to play out from the back and Sunderland pressed them really well, completely shut them down. The second half went very direct to Lyle Taylor and it caused a lot of problems, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But hopefully the way that Elaine's been playing in recent weeks and the way that Tom Flanagan's played in recent weeks, hopefully they'll be going into this game with a lot of confidence, because they've taken on some big target men themselves in recent weeks. Ollie Horton's been one of them and done really well, so it's going to be a big challenge for them, but hopefully it's one they'll be going into with a lot of confidence.
Obviously Taylor is a different sort of target man though, isn't he? He's very much, he tries to get in the channels. It's a different proposition for an Ali Moss Taylor and Tom Flanagan to what they've went up against, but similar in other respects.
Absolutely, and I think if you go back to the opening day of the season, he was someone that I wasn't overly familiar with, but someone I left the stadium I was very impressed with. Charlton performed exceptionally well, particularly in the first half. They would feel aggrieved that they hadn't managed to at least come away with a point. But I think you can't simply focus on stopping Lyle Taylor, even if you're going to try to put so much emphasis and focus on to stifling what he can do. You have to stop the service to him, and then of course it becomes much more of a team effort. And as much as he has been the focal point of Charlton's performances throughout the season, you can't ignore, what others have contributed. And the one thing that they do have in their favour is that despite the result after 120 minutes against Doncaster, they are arguably at least the form team in the division. I don't think Lee Bowyer could have dreamt that they could have managed to finish third, even just 2 or 3 games away from the end of the league campaign, but that is where they've finished. They're there on merit, and I've got no doubt it'll be a difficult undertaking on Sunday.
Joe Aribo's another player that I've sort of been watching closely this season because he impressed in the opening day at the stadium. He's got 10 goals from midfield, and he's probably the most dynamic midfielder in the league, certainly central. Do you think, as well as Lyle Taylor, he needs to be the other player that we focus attention on?
Well, I think that it's certainly right to bring up his goal record when you consider he missed about 6 weeks of the season. I think with injuries, that's an impressive effort. I think that Charlton's midfield diamond is probably something they've strengthened since they played here on the first day of the season. They brought in Bielik and Josh Cullen from Arsenal and West Ham on loan, and I think that kind of 4 in midfield has been a big part of them. It's a formation we've seen used by a lot of teams this season, and it depends how he sets up, because obviously he went with 3 at the back in the semi-finals, and it'll be interesting to see where he plays Aribo, but he's certainly a player who makes great runs, and he's a really, really big threat. Hopefully, if Sunderland's midfield can replicate what they did at Portsmouth, because they were so disciplined in their positioning, they used the ball so well, slowed the game down when they needed to. That's going to be really, really important to try and not make it too open, so the players like Aribo get plenty of space to run into.
And over the 2 legs against Doncaster, they were comfortable in the first leg away from home, but then when Doncaster came to the Valley with a big crowd, Charlton struggled. It's fair to say they struggled. They didn't seem to deal with the occasion quite as well as you'd expect. Do you think that's the sort of thing that might benefit Sunderland, because we've seen that they maybe cracked a little bit under the pressure at the Valley, or maybe I'm just being a bit too harsh?
No, I mean, I think if you go back to the game at Doncaster, just prior to Doncaster scoring towards the end of the game, Charlton had a very good opportunity to go 3-0 ahead. And if that had materialised, then you think that the second leg becomes a foregone conclusion, because it's very difficult to get even half of the Doncaster players to believe that they can actually recover. But that said, there were signs of nerves, and it obviously took a penalty shootout to eventually separate the sides. I've got no doubt that the vast majority, if not all Sunderland fans, were hoping that Doncaster would prevail. But it's not to be, and I think it would be negligent and remiss of Jack Ross if he didn't prepare for the Charlton that has been very evident in the closing stages of the season, rather than the one that may well have looked angst-ridden in the game at the Valley several days ago.
We'll jump now to Sunderland versus Portsmouth. The most important thing to talk about is that Chris Maguire goal that just happened behind us here. That was the deciding factor, that little bit of quality, and in Wembley these sort of games are often settled by that little bit of quality. So do you think that is in Sunderland's favour, that Chris Maguire scoring that goal here, could he replicate that again and get the winner at Wembley? He's certainly that big game player that would thrive on that occasion.
Yeah, I think he's someone who'll be looking forward to the challenge. I'm sure he'll try and get himself into the game early. If you can wind Charlton up a little bit, I'm sure he'll take that opportunity as well, because he seems to thrive on that expectation and that pressure. It's an interesting one, because Chris has done fantastically well to come back from what was a pretty serious injury and make a good contribution over the closing stages of the season. How you use him is a really interesting question for Jack Ross, and something I'm sure we'll be thinking about a lot this week, because that Portsmouth game here at Stadium Light was the perfect example of a substitution well executed. You might not have been at his freshest because of the time he'd spent on the sidelines previously with his injury. He came on when Portsmouth were a little bit tired, got himself into that, and don't forget the movement for that goal. The finish was outstanding, but the way he drifted into that little pocket of space,
and then he scored again,
anticipated the header, it was absolutely brilliant. So he's definitely a player that can contribute, but he's also someone who can come on strong in the last stages of games as well, which in the pressure of a Wembley game, the size of the crowd, mental fatigue as well as the physical one, those are the kind of players that can win you a game.
Defensively, that was 2 straight clean sheets as well. Something we've not really seen this season. Sunderland haven't been a team that keeps clean sheets, and if you keep a clean sheet at Wembley, you have a very good chance of winning the game. So do you think that's a really big building block to have got them clean sheets?
Without a doubt, for confidence alone, it's worthwhile. And I think if you look over the course of the season, the very fact that so many within the broad support would put forward John McLaughlin as being player of the season would perhaps tell you that the defence hasn't been as good as it could have been. But that said, and just really to echo what Phil has says, the performance at Portsmouth was for me Sunderland's most mature performance of the season. I think the manager got his team selection exceptionally good. He got it right. Also, in light of what we heard after the match about Grant Ledbetter's mother, it's great testament to him that he had the mental resolve to take to the field when many would have understood if he decided against it. So, although of course it's not the similar dynamics of a two-legged affair, if Sunderland were to go a goal to the good on Sunday, then what we witnessed at Fratton Park is something you would hope could be evident again in the second half or the latter stages of the game, because the greatest testament I can play to the players is that when you consider the aftermath of the game here against Portsmouth in the playoffs, and when you consider the opening stages at Fratton Park, it looked to all intents and purposes as if the game would finish in quite a temperamental or tempestuous manner, and Sunderland, through experience, completely stifled and took the sting out of anything Portsmouth had to offer. And by the time the final whistle went, any notion of acrimony had completely diminished. And that's because Sunderland I think they've really done a number, and Jack Ross deserves a lot of credit for it.
And talk about Jack Ross there, talk about tactics a little bit as well. How do you think we'll approach the game at Wembley? He went with a more defensive midfield 3 last time out because of the occasion. Do you think this time he'll maybe go back to his 4-2-3-1, or do you think maybe he'll drop another midfielder in to try and combat Charlton's diamond?
Well, I think that if you look at the way he approached the game at Fratton Park, the thing that he'd spoken about most in the run-up to the game was composure. Part of that was keeping your head, as Kieron mentioned, not getting into off-the-ball incidents that could cause issues, potentially get a man sent off. But mostly it was about the way he used the ball. don't give it straight back to them. Don't let them build that pressure. And I think that's why he brought Grant in. That's why he picked that very experienced midfield. And particularly in the second half, the way they played those little triangles, the way they kept the ball in Portsmouth half, took the sting out of the crowd, took the sting out of the game. But I think he also did that because he didn't have Aiden. And what we've seen from Sunderland, and Jack Ross would tell you he believes, and I think it's a fair point, they are one of, if not the best team at getting their wingers in dangerous positions. The way they build the play up, the way they get their wingers one-on-one. If you've got a player like Aiden and you can do that, you've got a great chance of scoring goals. So I think, it's not a stretch to say at all that depending on how Aiden goes this week and depending on how fit he is, that's going to have a huge impact on how Jack approaches the game, because when you've got a player like that, you want to build around him, you want to get him in the best positions, and if he's not there, you might have to take a slightly different approach.
And speaking of Aiden, obviously he will have had pretty much a month since he's played his last game of football. Do you think, hopefully that means that he will be fit? I mean, it's hard to know. Obviously he's been having the injections as well to get him through it.
When you're a winger and you're blessed with the ability that Aidan McGeady has, and what we've witnessed this season is Aidan McGeady looking like someone that has fallen in love with football again. And that's also something that Jack Ross deserves a lot of credit for. Aidan McGeady will have no difficulty in getting by 90 minutes on Sunday, even 120 minutes, if he is free of injury. He may not be as physically sharp as you would like, but I still think that can be more than compensated for by someone who is so evidently enjoying their football.
Yeah.
So if Aidan is free of any discomfort or pain, I would be very surprised if he doesn't make the starting 11.
One thing we do have to touch on, because of this game, is the 98 playoff final. I don't want to spend too much time on it though, it's been done to death and we've all seen it a million times. But do you think that fixture can play any role? Do you think Charlton will use it as a motivational tool looking back at that game, or do you think it's just history gone, forget about it?
It's something I believe that is almost exclusively for the supporters to be sentimental about, or to remember the sadness that came as a consequence of it, but primarily for the players, management and coaches, it's got very little relevance.
Yeah, just totally gone. Ignore it.
Clive Mendonca, Mickey Gray, I'm sure they've been inundated this week in terms of interview requests, but for the modern day players, I mean, if we just stick to the issue of playoffs, when I played, when I was 18 or was involved when we beat Newcastle, there wasn't any references from Dennis Smith about bygone days against Newcastle. It was just focusing on the job in hand. We didn't manage to beat them at Roker Park, but we then managed to go to St James's Park and complete the job. Then of course we were completely decimated against Swindon, but we always knew there was some financial chicanery afoot and that our place was assured. So I've got quite surreal, happy memories of the playoffs. I was in my auntie's house just outside Glasgow in the summer of 1990 and found out from News at 10 that I was going to be playing in the top flight within several months because of the financial irregularities at Swindon. So I know Wembley on the day has not been a happy hunting ground over recent decades, but hopefully on Sunday it's just a convincing, indisputable victory.
And this is also our second game at Wembley this season. Do you think that's a benefit to our players?
I think potentially it depends how you reflect on that final. I think the players will hopefully take a lot of confidence from the way they started the game, because the atmosphere was incredible. It didn't feel like a Checkatrade Trophy final. It felt like an FA Cup final because of the support that was in there. And you have to say the way the players approached the first half was fantastic. The control they had on the game, the opportunities they created, they played with real poise. The second half, Portsmouth switched things around a bit and they got on top of Sunderland, and Sunderland probably struggled to adapt to that game. But I think it can only be a benefit for the players to have experienced that kind of atmosphere quite recently. The pressure's going to be very different on Sunday, and I suppose that's the main difference, because the stake's going to be so high and no one's going to want to be the player that makes that mistake or does something that contributes to you losing in a playoff final. But I think it will be a little bit of a benefit, particularly for the players who've not played at Wembley before, to have that experience of that atmosphere. How much of a difference it'll make over the 90 minutes, it's quite hard to gauge, I think.
I think it's a different type of pressure. For me, the Checkatrade Trophy was much more about the occasion
Like a bonus, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the fans enjoying it, particularly in the 24 hours leading up to it. I think this is much more about what happens on the day, because although I appreciate that staying in League One for another season may not be financially calamitous, there's no doubt that it would be a huge disappointment when you consider that throughout the season it has for the most part been set against a backdrop of a returning feel-good factor and optimism. I think it will have benefits for the players that they've been to Wembley so recently. They might not, some of them might not have felt they could enjoy the occasion before, because it was after all a cup final, but I would like to think that little things might have filtered in and may reduce the nerves and anxiety that they may feel. The other thing, and it can't be overlooked, is that you get a very good understanding of the surface. And if you go back to the opening half hour at Fratton Park, there were some concerns over the footwear that some players were wearing. And it's fortuitous in a way that Sunderland were not knocked out and question marks hadn't been raised about the footwear that Chris Maguire was wearing, because he slipped at a critical point when Sunderland had a very good opening in the first half. So things like being aware of the footwear you're going to use is really important. Of course, there's always the perception about Wembley being this huge expansive area, but I don't think many people actually do any assessments to actually ascertain how big it actually is compared to the stadium of like Fratton Park, the Valley, etc. But it is a huge occasion, live on television, and of course the carrot of promotion. And you know, it would be very disappointing if it wasn't realised, because the players, and you'll know this, and you'll appreciate it certainly more than players, I think, the supporters have been able to witness players giving their all this season, in stark contrast to what we witnessed in the Championship.
And do you think, I mean, when I was thinking about the psychological advantage of playing there before, I'm thinking about before the game, Charlton players will be going out taking selfies. They'll be thinking about it the night before maybe a bit more than the Sunderland players who were there just a few months ago. They already did all that. They can just focus literally on the game, forget about the stadium, forget about the occasion. Do you think that could play into it, or do you think I'm just missing the point?
I think the Charlton have probably got a lot of experienced players. They've got some very young players as well, but players who are used to being in big club environments. People like Lyle Taylor, who were very experienced professional. Johnny Williams, I'm not sure if he's been at Wembley before, but he's certainly got experience of playing at a big club in high divisions. So I'm not convinced that they'll be kind of wide-eyed about Wembley. I think it's absolutely right what you're saying, and what Kieron said there about players' habits, I think will be really good for Sunderland. They'll know what it's all about, they'll know what to expect, and I think they'll be able to get into that almost business-like frame of mind much easier than perhaps they were for the Czech trip. Because for all of us, journalists, club staff, fans, going to Wembley in March, and for some of us it was the first time we've been there, and you're taking it all in, and I'm sure for the players this time it would be much easier to get into that very kind of business-like frame of mind.
I think also the experiences of a manager going back to their playing career can be very, very helpful to players, particularly the younger and more inexperienced players. And Lee Bowyer obviously had a very prolonged career at the elite of the game within English football. You know, when he wasn't trying to perpetrate GBH on Kieron Dyer, he had a career, you know, being at Leeds, being at Newcastle. So he'll be hoping to pass on little nuggets of wisdom. I know some managers might be completely averse to this idea of players taking selfies and taking photographs prior to the game, because it's given the impression that they're completely caught up in the occasion and perhaps neglecting the fact that they've got a job to do. But there's personal battles throughout. You know, Sunderland, without any shadow of a doubt, have got a much more experienced personnel in terms of playing squad. In terms of competing in big games, Aidan McGeady, Lee Cattermole, numerous others. But then, of course, at managerial level, that kind of changes. But Sunderland certainly should not be going there with any apprehension or fear.
And to the game itself, what do we expect? How do we expect both teams to approach it? Do you think it's going to be a high-scoring game, low-scoring? What do we expect to see come kick-off?
I would imagine it'll be two teams that have a huge amount of respect for each other, and I think that will probably manifest itself in quite a cagey game. I think if we look at...
So no 4-4?
I don't think it'll be a 4-4. I don't think my heart can take a 4-4, so I hope it's not a 4-4. But I think if we look at, you know, if we're looking for clues from the previous two occasions that teams have played each other, they've been very, very well balanced. Both teams have had spells of superiority in each game. If we go back to that game at the Valley earlier in the season, I thought Sunderland played some of their best football in the half an hour. Charlton were in a good run at the time. Sunderland went out, they did what they did best. They got the ball in the wide areas. They got some great crosses into the box. They really dominated midfield. But the thing about Charlton is they've got a coach who's impressing this year, and they've got good players. So they were able within the game to make those adjustments to balance the game out a little bit. In the second half, it was much more even. And so I don't see either side being so superior to the other that they can go out and blow them away. And I think both managers will be very mindful of that. So I expect it to be quite a cagey game. But I think it's one where there's so many players of individual quality, as you mentioned before, that does make it very, very difficult to call.
Kieron, what do you think?
You know, I think because of the occasion, it's very difficult to assess how players will react. You may have players that are regarded as the vital players on either side, but if they're overcome by the occasion and the emotion, then they may not be able to contribute in the manner that they generally have throughout the season. I cannot decide. I think it's as 50-50 as you can get. You know, I know that Sunderland have the slight edge because of Lyndon Gooch's goal, but over 90 minutes here it was 1-1. Over 90 minutes at the Valley it was 1-1. It's just quite fortunate that they played 95 minutes here on the opening day of the season. So with that in mind, both sides can be quietly confident, but as Phil said, or I think you've touched upon, respectful of the opposition. There's not been much in it in terms of both games. There's not been much in it in terms of the points total that's been amassed by both sides. So it really is very, very difficult to predict. It might be that it does take a moment of magic from Aidan McGeady or Chris Maguire, but I've got no doubt that there might be a Charlton player of the past sitting in a studio now at the Valley saying it might take a moment of magic from Joe Reed or Lyle Taylor. I really think it could be that close. It might not be 4-4, but I wouldn't be that surprised if we do have goals in it, you know, because I think the occasion also can contribute to mental fatigue, and some of the players will be going there with this idea that the playing surface at Wembley is 250 yards by 50 yards when it's not really. But of course, so many of the games at Wembley take place in May, you know, when it's generally the weather is a lot better. It's at the end of a season. But if you're asking me for a prediction, God.
Well, maybe the prediction should just be, do you think this time in August we'll be doing a preview show talking about the championship?
That well done, Connor. You really worked your way around that to avoid us being.
I think the semi-final was a really, hopefully, a really good moment for the squad, because there's no doubt that for everyone associated with the club, the way the season ended was a massive disappointment. Yeah. And it felt flat, let's be honest, coming into this game at the stadium, like the whole place felt flat. And I know Portsmouth felt like that as well. But the way they applied themselves in those two legs, and the way they shut out a side who had caused them problems all season long in the second leg at Fratton Park, the fantastic scenes at the end, which weren't over the top celebrations, which I think was important, but they were rightly
pitch invasion.
Rightly took a lot of pride in what they'd achieved, and I just hope that gives them a huge injection of confidence and gives them a lot of confidence going into this game, because they should have that, because the composure and the experience that they showed at that game in Fratton Park should give them a lot of belief going into this game. And yeah, you don't want to be too confident. You never want to be too confident, but after winning those two legs, coming out on top, they shouldn't be going into this game with any kind of apprehension, because they've proven that they're more than good enough to beat any team in this league.
So that means you're saying we will be here in August talking about the championship.
I'm going to tentatively say that we are, yeah.
Kieron, do you agree?
Yeah. I know. And I've grown weary to a degree of speaking to Sunderland supporters who have been going to Wembley since 1985, all the way through 1990, 92, 98, 2014, and earlier on this year, etc. And they deserve some Wembley happiness, don't they? You know, they really do. They deserve it, not just for having been to Wembley as often as they have and experiencing such adversity, but just for been so loyal through the adversity that seems to be relatively common for Sunderland supporters.
Well, I'm looking forward to hugging Phil in the press box at Phil time.
There you go. I mean, what's not to embrace about that embrace?
That's if I'm still going. If it goes to penalties, I might be
I'd
retreating for some
Have
way.
you got superstitions in that regard?
No, but I just if my heart starts to go penalties.
Just look away.
That's very true. I mean, if only there was mobile phone footage that
Yeah,
would
that's true.
probably capture the moment. But I know, yeah, he's consummate professional. No doubt he'll do his
Thank
job.
you guys for coming along and
Thank you.
hopefully,
Thank you for having me.
fingers crossed, we'll finally win at Wembley.